Okay, welcome to your vodcast on the urban environment. I just wanted to introduce you some concepts, and we'll be digging in class. So, in this vodcast, I wanted you to be able to define urbanization, define megaregions, sometimes called megacities. I prefer megalopolis just because I like to say megalopolis. Um, we'll be looking into the heat island effect and its solution, and then also impervious surfaces. So, the definition of urbanization, of course, the concept is simple. We're moving from not urban areas to urban areas. What constitutes an urban area is actually quite tricky because different countries, different organizations use different standards. Some use land use, whether or not it's farming or not, for instance. Most use kind of a number, so in 1,000 or more people in one settlement, a defined settlement like a city or a town would be urban. I prefer density, a certain number of people per given area, but we have to be careful when we're looking at statistics for it because there's so much variability. Before I go any further, I did want to note that while we'll be talking a lot about problems of urbanization in cities, cities can be very efficient places for people to live, at least for an individual. If you think about access to public transportation, for instance, in a rural area you might have to drive miles and miles to get to work, whereas in a city many people can take a subway line or a bus line. Similarly, if you're heating your home, if you live in a city, in New York City, for instance, an apartment, heat loss through your ceiling or walls or floor will go into the neighboring apartments, or at least much of that, and thus heat the neighboring apartments, kind of like carpooling your energy use. If you have a standalone house in a suburb, right, a suburban area, or a rural area, that heat loss, of course, will be to the environment, not be used by your neighbors. So just food for thought. Of course, as cities are so dense in people, the resources they use are significant, and thus they do represent a major consumptive part of our society. So let's look at urban population growth. Something very interesting happened within your lifetime. 2010, we think the world's population became more urban than not, so more people living in cities. And this is a trend that's been happening for quite some time. Urban population growth peaked in 1960s with a growth rate of about 3%. And we're going to see this continuing. The number of urban residents is still growing by about 60 million people per year. We expect that number to double. So there was around 3.4 billion in 2009. We think it'll be 6.4 billion by 2050. Almost all the urban growth in the next 30 years will be in the less developed countries. From 1995 to 2005, less developed countries were adding 1.2 million people per week to their cities, or around 165,000 people per day. So we're talking big numbers. In the more developed countries, we actually think while the next 2 decades will see growth from 920 million people in cities to about 1 billion people by 2025. That growth is slowing. So in many cities, if there is growth, it'll be due to immigration from people outside the country. And so without immigration into cities, we'd expect those cities to actually start declining or at least remain static. So as cities grow in size, they engage in, of course, what is often referred to as sprawl. And we'll dig into that term. It's obviously a very loaded term. But the organizations like the UN have been interested in sprawl, especially as it eats up other types of land use, farm use, suburban areas, or other rural uses. And so one such megacity where two cities are actually growing together is, for instance, the area from Hong Kong to Gaozu. So you can imagine as all these cities grow outwards, they begin to absorb farmland between them or other uses between them until you have essentially one continuous urban area. And so this one's home to 120 million people, but you'd see this around the world. You can see this using nighttime satellite imagery. So here are some emerging regions in the United States that might be megalopolises or considered megalopolis. Here's one called Bowash, Boston to Washington. I love these because we name them like we name celebrity couples. And so this area on the eastern seaboard is continuing to urbanize. Of course, currently there is a lot of open and green space, but the question is what will happen in the future? And so one idea here is that as city urbanize, we lose productive ground. So we lose soils that we could grow food or have forests. And so you remember the concept of net primary productivity from biology? And so NASA did a study trying to calculate how much net primary productivity is lost due to urbanization. Many of these cities, of course, besides being selected for easy transport by ship, mostly when these cities were founded, important rivers or harbors, bays. They also were near highly productive agriculture areas. So as cities expand, they can eat up farmland, and that farmland has wonderful soil for growing food, but also would be very useful for maintaining ecosystems. And so, of course, not only losing food production, but also potential carbon sinks. And so that's one particular issue. Another big one of the main focus for this vodcast, are the heat island effect. So the heat island effect is the notion that as you urbanize an area, it tends to get warmer. And so let's dig into that a little bit. Pause, if you will, in just a second and try to interpret this graphic. Go ahead, pause. Come back. So now you're back. Of course, I'm sure you saw the y-axis. We're looking at temperature. The x-axis, we have different land use types. And then we have this interesting look at day and nighttime temperatures that's further divided into surface temperatures and air temperatures. And so very quickly you can see that there's a greater variance between surface temperatures and air temperatures during the day. Look how closely correlated they are at night. Another interesting thing is this huge dip, right? And if you go down, you see it's over a pond. And of course, that makes sense if you think back to our prior work with the heat capacity, the high heat capacity of water. So you're going to have less variation over water than you would over other surface types. And so the annual mean air temperature of a city with 1 million people or more can be 1.8 to 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than its surroundings. And that's during the day. But on a clear, calm night, however, the air temperature difference can be as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees C. So you have very, very warm, relatively warm nights in cities. So much warmer in a city at night than the surrounding area. And this is important to us because of phenomenons like heat waves. As you have very warm nights, the city's unable to cool down, and so you have these extended hotter heat waves. And so many researchers have been arguing that these heat waves actually are leading to much higher rates of deaths. And we do know that heat waves do cause death. Chicago has had a problem with this for quite some time. You can see this incredible statistic about deaths related to heat during a heat wave in Chicago. And these are often vulnerable elderly people. So elderly people, of course, have greater difficulty regulating body temperature. Think of homeostasis, right? And if they are low income and have, you can imagine, an electrical failure, or they don't have air conditioning, they are more prone to suffering from these heat waves. And so cities have started setting up things like cooling centers during these events and shuttles that try to get elderly people to places like that. So this is being studied around the world, and you can see these statistics on various cities. And of course, what's causing this is it's kind of twofold. We have changes in albedo, and of course you would change albedo by taking areas of vegetation, losing areas of vegetation, and putting darker surfaces in. The other one we'll talk about in a minute, and that's changing the permeability of a surface, messing with evaporation basically. But let's focus on albedo. This should be easy for you to interpret at this point in the year, and you can see, of course, white paint's getting up to 90% albedo with asphalts being incredibly low. And so whether you have a tar and gravel roof or not will dictate whether or not your building is absorbing more energy and warming that area. And so if you compound that over the entire city, you get to the heat island effect. And you can map heat islands based on vegetation. So you can see here the satellite image where you can see a lot of vegetation, and it maps up inversely with temperatures following the urban areas. And you can do this in places like Baltimore, any city really. Here's a nice one around New York where you can see the temperatures and how well they correlate with or inversely correlate with vegetation. So what are the solutions to the heat island effect? Of course, lowering albedo would be a huge one. So people are talking about replacing our black top roofs, the gravel and tar shingle roofs with rooftop garden spaces, which would do two things, of course, lowering albedo, but also increasing evaporation and providing that cooling effect. Simpler, probably cheaper, painting our roofs white. Believe it or not, this is potentially a huge political issue, because imagine telling a city you have to paint your roof white. There was a huge uproar when President Obama just suggested that we should be inflating our tires more for fuel efficiency. So even simple solutions can have significant political setbacks, but this would potentially reduce the heat island effect and avoid those heat waves and potential related deaths. I mentioned impervious surfaces, so how do they contribute? It's really the loss of evaporation. As you have impervious surfaces, surfaces that don't allow water to penetrate, you have higher rates of runoff, and thus you're losing the water that would otherwise be stored in soils and in vegetation, and so you're decreasing the amount of evaporation, and so you're decreasing a cooling effect. On a related note, not around heat islands, but just around impervious surfaces, those surfaces have a variety of other impacts, mostly biological in nature, by changing how water moves, where it stays, and bringing things like oil and pollutants, pesticides off of impervious surfaces to those waterways. If you just drive around Carp, or if you're on Stream Team, you can look at any of those streams and see the ones that we've replaced with culverts, with cement lining. And we'll talk about why we did that when we get to our water unit. But we've replaced what used to be a creek or a river with trees and vegetation and all sorts of animals and aquatic life with cement. And so impervious surface has a correlation with loss of biodiversity. So, of course, ways to deal with this issue: increasing green space, absolutely. But Kate itself has done things like, if you've seen our asphalt, we have a type of asphalt that's permeable, allows water to pass in. Of course, not using things like asphalt and cement, but using gravel or even sand-based parking lots would help alleviate this issue. Okay, that's a quick and dirty introduction. We'll talk more about this in class.